Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we are going to discuss Clear by Carys Davies. This is a book, I have to say, that I feel like a little sloppy about. It was a book that I saw often, on the front table of two of my favorite independent booksellers, and I would pick it up and I would read like the very first part of the back cover, and for some reason it just was not grabbing me. I think if I had taken the time to read all of the copy on the back cover, it really would have sucked me in. I think I got to the part where it was about two men and one of them was injured and there was some sort of convalescence, and it just really felt kind of heavy. But then I read a book called Ultramarine by Mariette Navarro, and I got kind of into this ocean thing. That is a book that has a lot to do with the ocean, and it is a book that I also resisted and then ended up loving. So I picked up Clear and decided I would dive in. Oh my God, no pun intended. And again, I have to say I was a bit sloppy. It was literally a couple of hours ago. That's not true. I saw this yesterday when I was pulling together the lecture, that I saw the teapot on the cover in this big wave. I have to say, maybe my brain was not wanting to see the teapot because I don't love cover art that's a little bit too literal, a little too on the nose. And I preferred thinking that this giant, beautiful wave on the cover of the book was taken from some other piece of art. I love when a small detail of a larger painting is used on a front cover. So once I saw the teapot, I was like, oh gosh, I was actually sort of happy that I hadn't seen it in the very beginning. I think this book also, both this and Ultramarine, suffered a little bit because I had just read them after I had finished Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I found that book absolutely gut-wrenching and it just destroyed me in the very best of ways during my rereading of it. But I found it so incredibly gorgeous that honestly anything I read after was going to suffer by comparison. However, in the case of Clear and of Ultramarine, as I got into these texts, both of them are not very long, I realized not only what an absolute beautiful and deep and rich and deceivingly simple thing I was holding in my hand, but I also realized that both were going to be tons and tons of grist for my mill. This was a book that was so satisfying to really dig into. I found it quiet, I found it brief, it was just so gorgeous, and its preoccupation with language was so striking. I also was so taken by the relationship that these men develop during the convalescence of one of them, and the way that this small kind of microcosm, literally a microcosm, two men on an island, the way that came to stand in for so much more. I also just found the ending incredible. It was one of those books where the ending sort of gave the whole thing a twist that made it just deeper and more resonant and more poignant in a way that I totally loved. That's a good time to tell you, we're not going to have any spoilers until the end of the book, and then we are going to take a look at the close. I will obviously tell you before we dive into the close of the book. So if you haven't finished, or if you're listening to this before you have read the book, you're going to want to tune out before that happens. So for those of you who like an agenda, today we're going to talk about, I'm not doing a bio of Carys Davies, but I am going to talk about the circumstances in which she wrote the novel, the sort of process and how she discovered the source material that led to this novel. We're then going to dive into the book. We're going to look at the title. We're going to look at the opening. We're going to take a little bit of a look at narrative stance. We're then going to talk about the incredible tension. This is a book that gives away quite a bit on the copy that is on the back cover of the book. But it was also there was so much tension. It was a book that in very simple ways, and in ways that maybe should have been kind of too on the nose, it presented the reader with these real sources of propulsion, these real questions and these real kind of threats that we had to weather. Again, no pun intended. A lot of that came from the parallel stories. They do tell you in the copy on the back that Mary, John's wife, does get worried and comes. I actually was very happy that I did not get to that part. But for those of you who have read the back, you know that in fact Mary is going to come and find them. Part of the tension is that Mary, may arrive and she may in fact upset the equilibrium that has been set on the island. But there's so much more. There are all of these subtle ways that Carys Davies is adding so much tension, and there's so many big questions. I wouldn't necessarily say plot. I mean, this is a book where not a ton of plot is unfolding. But it is a book where there's lots of tension, and that tension is building upon like a major piece of history that, of course, I had no idea about. It's also one of those books that kind of realigned literally like my sense of geopolitics and my sense of history. I mean, that may be a tiny bit of an overstatement, but it was a revelation. So after we talk about the tension and the way that Carys Davies does that so well, we are going to talk about history. Then we're going to move on to talk about religion. Just pretty simply, I loved the way that religion was treated in this book. Then we're going to talk about language. This is a novella. It's not a novella, it's a short novel that is entirely preoccupied with language in a way that is so satisfying. And we're going to look at the nuances of that, because what the language is standing for is hugely important. And I think it's something that, if you're not me and you're not going back and preparing a lecture about it, some of that nuance might have escaped you. And then after we've talked about the language, we are going to talk about the close of the book, but I will obviously let everyone know before I bust out any spoilers. So the circumstances of this book are pretty remarkable. I listened to quite a few interviews with Carys Davies. She's so well-spoken. And it's funny because whenever I do this and do kind of a deep dive, you have the author repeating the same thing over and over. And people would ask her how she got the idea of this book. And she would talk about how she was in, I think it's the National Library in Scotland, in Edinburgh. And when she would get kind of stuck on whatever she was working on, she would go into the reading room. And in that reading room, she came across this dictionary of this old defunct language. It was spoken by Danes on islands above Scotland, so in the far north, kind of between Scotland and Scandinavia. And she was really moved by the things that this dictionary described. They seemed like words that held a huge amount of emotion and a huge amount of nuance. And so that was the starting point for her to write Clear. Again, I talked about being a little sloppy before. I didn't notice that there was a glossary of words until I got toward the very end. And she also mentions this, of course, in the author note at the end. I have to say, maybe because it's not a romance language and so I just don't have any context for it, I did not read through that glossary very closely. I really got into the words when they were in the text of the novel, but I did not really dig into the linguistics and the semantics and whatnot of that list at the end in the glossary that she provides. But I love the way that glossary is a nod to the fact that the source material is this dictionary. And it also mirrors, of course, the ways that John Ferguson is really involved in language. He's both writing this glossary of his own dictionary of the language. He's also, at this point, translating the Gospels into Scots, Scots being a dialect, spoken in Scotland historically. This is 1843 when this book takes place, and Scots is a language that was already dying, which we're going to talk about when we focus on language. But so language was very much the starting point for Carys Davies, and it's hugely important, both in terms of what's happening in the book, but also just in terms of the texture of the book. All of this, by the way, importantly, is coming from NPR's Book of the Day from June 27th of 2024. If you're on the YouTube, I will go ahead and put up that little album cover, I think is what they call it. This is a podcast. And I would really recommend, if you are a fan of this book, I would recommend going and listening to it. There's a beautiful part where Carys Davies actually reads a section, and when she is speaking, she reads a section of the novel, and it has quite a few of these Norse words in it. But when she reads aloud this chunk of the novel, and I did not experience this as an audiobook, I read the whole thing. It's so short, I didn't really need to dig into it as an audiobook. But the same thing would have happened. I mean, if you have the audiobook, then you've already experienced this. The idea of having those words pronounced out loud instead of reading them on the page was so interesting and so moving. In that same podcast, they talked about another book that she wrote. I also listened to another podcast. It was the Barnes & Noble one, and I'll put that album cover up too if you're interested in that. That one talked a lot about another book that she wrote called West. The thing that was interesting to me is in that book, which is about the American West, you have another pair of men, and they don't speak the same language. It also has to do with settler colonialism. This is a person, an indigenous person, a native person to North America. And then we have this man, apparently, who arrives, and he is searching for woolly mammoths, or I would imagine the remains of them. The book sounds amazing. It's a book that is concerned with language because they don't speak the same language. But in that book, the person who was the colonialist guy, the one who was coming in with his kind of Western, Northern European vibes, he was not interested in learning language. So I think it would be interesting to see how that plays out in that book. But she talked about how her books tend to have these pairs of men. And she talked a lot about needing to write things that were outside of her life. And these certainly seem to be things that are outside of her life. She was also so clear, and I loved this part of it, that she has these pairs of men who are in these kind of like extreme situations, but there's always a woman who is like a very key player, even if feeling more like a minor character. In West, it is the daughter of the man who is looking for woolly mammoth remains. In that book, we have a young daughter she's like 10 or 11 in the book, and apparently amazing things happen with her. She's like a very courageous young girl, and I would hope that West has the same sort of twist, the same sort of turn that we have at the end of this book. It makes a novel, again, that is very quiet and relatively brief. It makes it into something much more, and something incredibly satisfying when we have these kinds of twists, these kinds of, in some cases it's really like action, and I don't know about West, but there's a little action at the end of Clear that gets pretty exciting. But I am very interested in this pattern that Carys Davies seems to have. The last thing I'll say before we dive in and start looking at the title and the text itself is that I did find this book, like obviously as someone who is deeply interested in linguistics, part of my PhD is it's romance, language, literature, and linguistics. I love linguistics, but this is not my field. It's all romance language and romance linguistics. It's all from Latin that I am a specialist. But obviously, I'm really interested in language and in translation and how language really does shape the way that we see and the way that we experience the world. But one thing that was like very much apart from language in this book that I found incredibly important is the physicality of these two men, partly because they are isolated and also because they are vulnerable. They're in a situation, Ivar has just been very sick, and then of course, John has had this accident. They are two men who are like corporeally, like bodily, very vulnerable, and they're having to like kind of minister to each other. That's kind of funny because in this book it's Ivar who's doing the ministering, but in fact John is the one who is an actual, capital M minister. But they're caring for each other, and all sorts of, vibes kind of arise from this situation. And I was acutely aware throughout of their bodies, of the proximity of their bodies, of descriptions of their bodies. So language was a big part of it, but for me, I kept coming back to the sense that it's like a very like embodied kind of experience that we were having. And that was, for me, one of the true geniuses. And it's one that in all of the interviews I heard, it gets sort of elided because everyone is so focused on language. So if I had Carys Davies in some sort of interview, I would actually really want to talk to her about the physicality of these two men and the energy between them. So now we are going to go ahead and dig in to the text itself, to the title, and to the beginning few paragraphs. So if you are a listener to the Fox page, you know what I'm about to say, which is that if you want to get a richer experience out of reading, you simply need to slow down and pay more attention. You need to just like take a step back and do some thinking. Or honestly, just like let me do that for you. You can just plow through these books and then check on in. In this case, the title it's like so multivalent and so interesting, but it's kind of deceiving. It was one that like I don't think I had a sense of it for a while. But then once I started thinking about it, it just became really poignant and just such a good title. One of the things that is so interesting to me is the word clear doesn't start appearing, at least I think I'm correct in this. Whenever I read a book and it has a title that appears in the text, it always jumps right out at me. So I'm fairly certain, some of you out there might be proving me wrong any second, but I'm fairly certain the word clear does not start appearing until page 142, and it comes at a very important moment. And we're going to take a look at that, but not until the end, because obviously 142 is relatively close to the finish of the novel, and it has everything to do with the conclusion. The book is 184 pages long, so we're not too far from the ending when we first start hearing mention of the word, and then it comes many times, which we're going to look at. But even if you don't have that word in the text, it has all sorts of connotations. So first of all, we have the idea of the clearances. That is mentioned on the back cover. It's mentioned in the author's note. So the clearances was that process by which all of the wealthy landowners in Scotland were forcibly moving all of the people who were on their land so that they could have sheep up there and make more money. This is not well, in some cases it is kind of a subtler kind of colonial kind of thing. It's like that kind of, pushing people out of their land. And this would have been a different, the Danes and the sort of Scandinavian people on the islands north of Scotland are being pushed out by the Scottish people. But in many ways, it has more to do with class. It has more to do with the land owning class versus the people who are working the land. We also, of course, have the idea of a story being clear, of language being clear. The preoccupation with language comes pretty early. So you have this sense of things as not being clear. We also have weather. There's so much weather in this book, and there's like fog and rain and weather that is obscuring things. But so you have this idea of clear skies, of like clear weather, a clear day. We also have, again, we're going to dig into this. We have a lot of religion in this book, and there is that sense of providence. Now I'm totally questioning my own definition of providence. My sense of providence is that like God has a plan and that things are going to sort of go the way that he wants it to. I also think it has to do with like being sinners and like having to like recover from our sins. If you're on the YouTube, I'm just going to go ahead and put up a little actual definition of providence. But one thing I will say, and I'm fairly confident about this, is that providence is a way to make clear something that is not clear. The future is not clear. Fate is not clear. The human condition is not clear. The fact that we are going to die and we don't know what is going to happen. All of that kind of idea of clear things, being able to see things, really comes into play with this question of religion. And then the last way that clear is really, I think, at work here is the nature of love, the nature of marriage, the nature of physical relationships, of physical passion, of romantic passion. In the beginning, we have this idea of Mary being in love. She also is in love with a Chinese spoon, I think, which is such a beautiful passage. But she was very much in love with this young woman named Alice Monk. So we have this idea of like categories of like clarity of the nature of relationships and of marriage and how these things function. You have the idea of John translating the probably like the King James Bible. I'm sure it's some sort of English Bible that he is now translating into Scots in order to make the Bible more clear. So there are lots of religious overtones that also have to do with language. It's a novel that is very much like preoccupied with this question of making things clear. I did think it was magical, though. We're going to look at the times when the word is actually said, and it is so poignant. There's one page where it's repeated 3 times in quick succession, and it's so moving. But honestly, this gets an A+ in terms of titling. Good job, Carys Davies. We're now going to take a look at the first couple of paragraphs, the first page. It's very slight and very beautiful. I am always struck by how incredible it is to go back and look at the beginning, or actually at any part of a book once you are finished. Any writer worth her salt is going to have these things be so carefully nuanced and carefully structured that lots of seeds are going to be planted in the beginning that as a reader you don't have context for, but if you go back and look for them, they are certainly there, and then the nuance becomes all the more clear. So we're going to dive in. He wished he could swim. The swimming belt felt like a flimsy thing, and it had been no comfort to be told not to worry. The men couldn't swim either. So this is very interesting. We have right away this idea of he. He is not named, which is an interesting thing. John Ferguson becomes a name that we are hearing a lot as we are moving through. It's interesting Mary does not have a last name. I mean, she becomes Mary Ferguson, but John Ferguson, in fact, Ivar, who also doesn't have a last name, is referring almost always to John as John Ferguson. I'm tipping my hand here a little bit, because we're going to talk about names later. But it's very interesting. Ferguson means son of like a very powerful man, one who's like very vigorous. So this idea of like patriarchy and this idea of being someone's son and this idea of having a last name that ties you to a family and to a history. Ivar, we do not have any of that. He's much more, we're going to talk a lot about this. He's much more like an Adam kind of figure in a setting that is actually very Edenic. So we're gonna talk a lot about Eden as we are moving through this novel. But right at the beginning, we have this idea of he. We also have this idea that he wishes he could swim. There's a lot of like sink or swim in this novel. And there is a sense of tension right here from the very beginning. We are opening at a very tense moment. We also, within this very slim first little paragraph, we have this setup between he and the men. So it becomes clear at the bottom of this page that we are talking about the other sailors. We can also sort of read the fact that the men, he versus the men, have to do with the men on the island. So we have Ivar, but a bunch of Ivar's family, his brothers, all drowned. So you have this sense of not being able to swim. You can also look at this swim, this idea of being in the water and then emerging as a kind of baptism, as a kind of renewal, as a kind of cleansing, as a kind of like starting over, like kind of like washing him, washing everything away and having John Ferguson be a new person when he gets onto the land. So just like these I literally think it's one sentence and it is giving us so much information. Okay, we're gonna move on. Each time they rose, he glimpsed the rocky shore, the cliffs, the absence of any kind of landing. Each time they descended, the rocks vanished and were replaced by a liquid wall of gray. He closed his eyes. Thump. Dear God. So quickly there, she has thump all in, not all, she has thump in italics here. This is a book that's preoccupied with language, but it's also preoccupied with noises, with sound in general, which we're going to take a look at. But this idea is introduced right from the beginning with a sound that is pretty ominous. So we have thump, and then right underneath that, it's, we have a new paragraph, and it's a very short little paragraph. It's a little sentence that reads, Dear God. So we have this introduction here of religion and the fact that, what John is going to do here is pray, because in fact he's a minister. He clung to the gunwale as they began to climb again, and he saw above the cliffs 1,000 birds soaring and wheeling. When the little boat tipped and plunged into the hollow trough on the other side, he knew it would be for the last time. So here she's really also like upping this tension. Like it's really, the idea of drowning here is really very significant. But after an hour on what one of the men described later as an uppity sea, John Ferguson found himself safely deposited, along with his satchel and his box, on the narrow strip of sandy beach that turned out, in spite of appearances, to exist in the shadow of the monstrous cliffs. Unbelievable. There is so much here. We have the idea of these cliffs. We have the idea of this being inhospitable. Also, though, the fact that like safe haven is kind of hidden and is not apparent to the at first blush. We also have these birds. So birds, when you see birds in literature, they should symbolize freedom. They should symbolize community in many cases. I mean, they can symbolize all sorts of things. But these, to my eye, have everything to do with freedom. It's interesting that he's talking about birds in general at the beginning, because one of the things that happens is he starts learning bird names in Ivar's language. And the fact that they are paying attention to birds is really speaking to their desire for freedom, not to mention their desire to sort of like understand nature. You could say they're trying to kind of dominate nature, but I like to think that Ivar, his relationship with nature has much less to do with dominance and much more to do with working with the spaces around you. Of course, also eating animals. But he does live in kind of relative harmony here on the land, certainly compared, he's supposed to be a farmer, so maybe not so much, but compared to the fact that they're just going to bring in sheep and have the island be uninhabited. So the novel opens on this like very tense note, and that tension just keeps building in ways that are very subtle. I mean, if someone asked you like, well, even on the back copy, if someone's like, what is this book about? Not a lot seems to happen, but there is so much tension. I want to just run through quickly like this relatively long list of all of the things that sort of happen in succession. The first, of course, is this question of like, is he going to drown? Then we learn, fairly quickly about this mission, the fact that he is there, it's not a very Christian sort of charitable thing, but he is so strapped for cash that he's doing this kind of the bidding of these landowners and trying to basically kick people, like send these people forcibly off of their land. And when he arrives, also, I will say very quickly, the beginning part, I really loved that. The whole time I was like, how is she not talking about how cold he is? I also wasn't clear how there's like a fruit cake that survives inside the box. I was like, how is the box not full of water? Like there were a couple of questions that I had, like kind of logistical things that were a little bit distracting, but I also liked the pace of it. Like Carys Davies was not bogging down on all sorts of like practicalities, but I was like, how is he not mentioning the cold? It has to be so cold. Maybe he's just used to it. But one of the tensions when we arrive and he is in the house, the Bailey house, which I don't know what Bailey means exactly. which the Bailey House has to do with the people who ostensibly own the land, sort of their outpost. But then he opens the box and we have a pistol. So anytime we have a gun, I mean, this is Chekhov. This is like a very like old tried and true thing. If we have a gun that, comes in the first act, I think the true Chekhov thing is that it's supposed to go off by the end of that act, by sort of that arc. But anytime a pistol shows up, you should be ready, in fact, for that pistol to be used. I loved how it was used in this novel. But we do have it, like, there's like this thing of like, is John going to have to defend himself? Is John going to kill someone? It's really upping the stakes of the whole thing. So then we meet Ivar, and we like him right away. He's a very likable character, as is John, which is important. We have sympathy for both of these men. And just as we're settling in with Ivar, John has this crazy accident. The description of the accident was so good. To me, it felt like tiny bit slapsticky. It's viewed from far because Ivar's not actually watching it happen. He discovers the body later, but it's viewed from afar on purpose because I think we are meant to see all of this happening from Ivar's perspective, not from John's. At this point, we're very much kind of with Ivar. And then honestly, let's see if this is a spoiler. This happens fairly early, but if you haven't read the book and you're concerned about spoilers, maybe skip ahead a bit. But then we have Ivar fall in love with this image. It's not called a photograph, it's something else. I can't remember right now. But he falls in love with this image of her, a calotype, I think that's what it's called. Which it's so interesting. Like John is like, no, Mary, it's not a daguerreotype, it's a calotype. The precision with words and like the insistence on using the correct terms for things is so part and parcel with like the priorities of these people, and it's what makes the preoccupation with language work so well. But so Ivar falls in love with this image of Mary, and you're like, oh my God, this is going to be awkward. He hides the little image behind the teapot, which is starting to tie all of these different elements together. And then on top of him falling in love with Mary, we realize that Mary is coming. So we have this beautiful structure and that really helps with the tension. We have these two men on the island, but then we have Mary, and at times it goes back and, we hear backstory about how Mary and Ivar, not Mary and Ivar. Wow, that would be a different kind of a book. That would be like jumping ahead or something, or I don't know, some sort of perversion of the plot. But we have a sense in this parallel storyline about how Mary and John have met. But then we have Mary arriving, like her arrival, her like slow progress toward the island creates so much tension because her arrival is going to be disruptive. So that is an ongoing tension that is so beautifully done. We then have Ivar, and this is a spoiler, so, close your ears. So we have Ivar transferring his love. It's not that he's purposefully doing it, but he feels that his love is being transferred from Mary to John, which is such a beautiful thing. It's kind of, he doesn't have judgment. He just feels it happening. It is not in the first person. We're not hearing, it's not Ivar saying, I suddenly love John now. And it's not totally clear what kind of love we are talking about. We don't know if this is devotion. We don't know if this is like brotherly love. There's lots of talk about Ivar's brothers. We don't know the nature of this love yet, although we have some idea because the way that he was drawn to Mary did seem relatively romantic. So he's transferring all of that love for Mary to John. And then you're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? So all of these different tensions are kind of running along. And another one that's kind of under, the undercurrent of all of this is like, what is going to happen with John's mission? John is supposed to like kick this guy off of the island, and a lot of time is passing. So you're kind of like, the Lowry people are not going to be happy about what's going on. Mary is on her way. So the question of whether or not he's going to succeed in this kind of unchristian but lucrative mission, all of that is very tense. So part of the reason why all of this tension works so well is that we believe it. We believe it as a reader. And because of the way that Davies is using history, it's the drama is kind of supplied for us because we have this idea of this major schism in Scotland and this idea of both the schism in the church, which is gnarly and really is putting John in a difficult position, but also speaks to his passion and this like negative thing with the landowners. But we also, I mean, if you know anything about the clearances, then which are mentioned on the back of the book, all of that kind of energy, I mean, the idea of forcibly removing people from their land, everybody would have a sense of the gravity of that. So the tension is really bolstered by history. One of the things that Davies said that was so interesting to me is that she does a decent amount of research, but doesn't like overdo it. She gets like just enough that she needs, and then she just gives the reader small pieces of it. And I loved the way she delivered this. We had the idea of that earthquake, which that part, the idea of her like false teeth popping out of her mouth, that to me seemed like I didn't completely buy that. Like I couldn't quite see it, which was fine because the rest of the novel felt so vivid to me. But we had, I think if we looked that up, I did not bother to look that up because we had plenty of other history to situate us. You probably would find that that's a real earthquake that happened, you know, some years before 1843, right when they were first meeting. But so you have this idea in 1843 of the schism in the Scottish Church. And anytime you have like a religious person, like religion, I think we all understand the weight that it carries and like literally wars that it can lead to. And what's excellent here is the schism in the church is in the background, but that's not really the point. The point here is that, you know, he's this minister and he's sort of like he should be this kind of Christian, you know, generous man. But because he doesn't have any money and he doesn't have a church to have, like he's alienated himself from the people with money, his survival and the survival of the church is at stake. So he's doing this mission, this thing. I shouldn't call it a mission probably because that has like religious overtones. He is doing the bidding of these people, and that's not it's not particularly religious. What we have there is the tension of the clearances. So she does it so well. I also really liked the front story where we have John and Ivar together. That feels to me, I mentioned it being Edenic earlier, it's very much like an Eden feel. You have this sense of them being completely out of time, out of touch with everything. It's like it could have been the 14th century or it could have been, you know, the 12th century. Actually, I don't know, probably not because they had a lot of like modern conveniences. Not a lot, but some. I loved the fact that all throughout that Ivar was knitting. I just couldn't get enough. You know, all of you who've been listening for a long time know that I'm a major fiber artist. I actually put on my fisherman knit sweater because that seemed very appropriate. And I looked so bad. I was totally washed out. Like this light here in New York is not really very favorable anyway. It was not a good look. So I took that off. If you're on the YouTube, I'll treat you right now to a bunch of images of the various things that I have created and that have been featured here on the Foxed page. And honestly, this is kind of a significant thing because Ivar is knitting, which is something that we associate with women. And the knitting is like something that comes up again and again. So it's something that, I mean, I think we're supposed to start seeing him as someone who's not caught up in, I mean, he wouldn't have societal expectations that are gender divided in the way that they are. I mean, you know, if you're living on an island like this and you're having to survive, knitting would be a very good skill, whether you're a man or a woman. That was a small digression. But I stand by the idea that they feel kind of out of time in this kind of beautiful, I mean, it's kind of hostile. It's like very passionate and there's all sorts of crazy weather. But it's one where Ivar certainly feels very at home. And one where John is actually, I mean, once he's like not so ailing, he's really sort of taken. He's really feels himself very much alive in this setting in a way that we do not see him in the backstory. What I like in the backstory, this kind of parallel, you know, vision that we have of John and Mary meeting and of Mary being on her way, is that when Davies is giving us historical stuff, she's just giving it to us. It's not, she doesn't have like some random paragraph that feels out of step. It all feels very organic. But it's also very straightforward. We're not having to like make a bunch of leaps. It's just, she's giving us information in really very skilled ways. So we've talked a bit about the tension and how the idea of this religious schism in the church, which is both historical and religious, how that adds a lot of tension, a lot of weight, a lot of gravitas to the plot itself. And one of the things that I think she did so well in subtle but very effective ways is to talk about John as a Presbyterian. So I was baptized Episcopalian, but I'm, you know, really agnostic/atheistic. Although I love rites, and I actually really like going to church, and I like all of the sort of the idea of faith, and I love all of the communion that can come with that. Communion in terms of community, not like actual communion. And of course, I know the idea of like wasps, like a, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So I have this idea of waspiness as being kind of like very puritanical and kind of uptight and being very like upper crusty in some ways. But I could not tell you like what like the Presbyterian Church actually stands for. And she does such a good job of telling us this in some subtle, effective ways, but also showing us some of the ways that John is beginning to really doubt this, what like he has shaped his life around these beliefs, and then is starting to, it's not even that he's starting to doubt them. It's so well done. So I'm going to read these 3 like chunks of text without a whole lot of analysis, but they're just absolutely striking in terms of how like the balance here, the skillful way that she's giving us this information, but also the straightforward nature of it. It's also very cool to see the way that like the description of religion in the book is kind of mirroring the way that his attitudes toward the church are changing. So on page 94, we're kind of like halfway through the book at this point. And this is told in one of the sections that has to do with John and Mary. It's kind of in that, it's the part of the novel where Mary is featured. At least John Ferguson hoped his refusal had been polite. He hoped he hadn't come across as high-handed or sanctimonious or superior. He'd heard Isabel through a door once asking Mary if she didn't wish she'd married someone who wasn't so serious, by which, he was fairly sure, she meant strict and humorless and dull and generally Presbyterian. I love the fact that Presbyterian is the last word there. And this is the beauty of going back and looking at these things. I marked it, I understood this was moving and important information, but now that I'm parsing it, it's even more so. So, all Isabel is saying is like he's kind of serious, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But then when he hears her calling him serious, wow, that was such a difficult pronoun thing I just did. I have to say, I love it when I get confused about English pronouns, because then in other languages, if I get a little bit like muddled or I have to like really think about my pronouns, I'm like, oh, this happens to me even in English, no problem. But it is so telling because Isabel simply calls him serious. And then what he extrapolates from that, what he himself thinks of, is strict and humorless and dull and generally Presbyterian. It's also nicely emphasized, this is something right here called polysyndeton, where you use and, like he's not using a comma. He could have just used a comma, strict, humorless, dull, and Presbyterian, but he's using the and to really emphasize and to give each of them really like its own due. It's so incredible because this is his own projection. When we are talking about religion, there's kind of the practical piece of it, and then there's what John himself is feeling, and it is so well expressed. Then on page 143, this is a point in the book. We're getting close to the end, so again, if you haven't read the book and you're concerned about spoilers, this isn't super obvious, but he's really thinking through this like mission that he has where Ivar is concerned, and it's a very tense part of the book. I could remind him, he thought, about providence. I could console him by explaining to him that his suffering, like all our suffering, is nothing more than punishment for our sins, that it is God's will and our Christian duty to submit to it. Which is so gnarly. I'm now thinking of my definition of providence. I thought it was more like God's plan for us, but it's kind of the same as like if God's plan is to just punish us for all of our evil, which this was so shocking to me. Like I don't have a lot of religious education, but any idea that we are born like as sinners is so insane to me. It's just like, it's beyond. I read that and I was like, what? Like, I mean, golly, like I know a lot of people, well, not, I don't know. It would be a very dark way to go through life. But what's fascinating here is we do have John starting to question it. So he's voicing this thing, and interestingly, it's all in italics, what the church is thinking, that like, you don't have to worry about your suffering because it's justified because you're a sinner. Like that's a terrible thing to say. And then we have this next paragraph, and it's just in Roman type, not italics. But crouching in the darkness of the hermit's cell, John Ferguson couldn't imagine talking to Ivar about providence. It seemed a shabby thing to him suddenly, an abdication of his own responsibility, a denial of his own involvement. All his life he had believed in providence. He was full of doubt now. Unbelievable. So good. This speaks again to that clarity, and it speaks to his evolution. On pages 162 and 163... This is one of the most beautiful scenes in the whole entire book, and it's so revealing. Also, anytime we're reading, these big chunks of text, it's just a chance to revel in this gorgeous prose. So on page 162, this is when Ivar has started humming, and then he wants to dance with John Ferguson. No, Ivar, no. He tried to muster the words and gestures to explain that in his church no one danced. In this respect, the new church did not differ from the old one. Dancing was ungodly and undignified and forbidden, and he was against it. Which, bummer. It's very Footloose. He laughed awkwardly again, wanting, after everything that had gone on earlier, to lighten the moment, but at the same time wanting to make it clear to Ivar, there's that word clear, that he was declining his invitation. He shook his head and folded his arms and crossed his legs. Then Ivar just makes it too fun, and so then he just has to start dancing. And then we have this really beautiful, very intimate scene. Ivar held him close and made the fast and raucous music with his mouth, music that was unlike anything John Ferguson had heard before, and he wondered if he was making the dance up too, or if they both were things he was remembering from long ago. Ivar lifted him up again, and John Ferguson heard himself shout. He tried not to, but he did. It was thrilling to feel Ivar's hands clamp him hard like that on his hips, and then to be almost thrown upward with the air rushing into his body. Each time it happened, he heard himself shout again from the shock and the thrill of it. But then, half a paragraph down, John sort of has, he just remembers who he is. He lowered his head, and to his vast distress, he was crying. "Forgive me," he whispered, hardly knowing who he was talking to, only knowing that he was guilty. So this is a hugely important chunk of the text here. It's so beautifully done. When Davies says that he doesn't know who he's talking to, clearly this is a crisis of faith. He's not believing in God and not believing in providence because he's having this experience. It's very important, in my opinion, that this dance is the way that this is happening, because in some ways dance is this physical union, and in many ways for me, this was kind of a bridge toward the ending of the book, which we're not going to talk about quite yet. But you have this idea of John as we are moving along in the text, he's really questioning things in a way here that has everything to do with joy and pleasure and communion and community and unity, but he's still just not ready for it. So the last chunk that we're going to discuss about his religious awakening or his religious crisis, it's close enough to the end of the book that we're going to discuss it with the ending of the book in case someone doesn't want that spoiler. So, but we're now going to move on to talk about language. This obviously is kind of in many ways the foundation of the book, and it is a book that is very preoccupied with language in the best of ways. And one of the things that Carys Davies has said in one of the interviews is that it's very interesting when she was looking at this list of words, they were such powerful words because they were so passionate and they were so nuanced and they had so much to do with like crazy weather and crazy phenomena of the ocean, all of this kind of dramatic stuff. And one thing that she mentioned, which is fascinating, is if you pay attention to the words that John is interested in understanding, it's very revealing. He's someone, who's a little rigid. As he said, he's I can't even remember what they are now, but, he's dull and he's rigid and he's serious and he's very Presbyterian. And in many ways, it's this language that he is learning that's opening up this whole kind of access to this part of himself and to this part of life and this way of living that is so foreign to him in the backstory. So on page 110, we have this. Certain words delighted him utterly. The one that describes the condition of a ball of wool, for example, when it had just been started, that described its innermost beginning when a fine thread of worsted was being wound, leaky, when the thing was at its very start of what it would become. So, that is pretty symbolic in lots of ways. So this is wool that Ivar is using. He's making the wool and he's making this ball, but then he will knit it. And the idea of knitting is not just awesome for me because I like to knit, but it's also very symbolic. Ivar is someone who's knitting things together. He's knitting things together in the domestic sphere. But the most important part of this is that we're really talking about a beginning. We're talking about something that's going to be wound together. A ball of wool is not going to be tangled. It's not going to be loose. It's going to be, very sort of comforting. But really, it's the important thing here, and this happens again and again with the language that we hear from John, is that this is about a beginning. He's understanding that in many ways his life is changing and this experience is beginning. And then on page 160, so we're 50 pages further into the book, and this is when language, he already was doing that translation into Scots, and Scots would have been kind of like a more peasant language. In fact, he learns it from his aunt's housekeeper. It's a language that is, at risk of becoming extinct, which is one of these things that Davies is very concerned about. So he was always someone who was interested in language, but it's taking on this whole new urgency that she articulates so well. So on page 160, he wanted urgently, there's the urgency, he wanted urgently, suddenly, to know the answer, to be able to describe things as they were instead of only guessing at them. Was the thick, drifting mist around the bottom of the white hill a hymna or a yema? Was it a rag or a dome? Not knowing the right words made him feel as far away and separate from Ivar as he had ever felt since the day he'd arrived. So that's kind of the crux of it. I'm going to continue, but can't help but interrupt myself. The crux of it here is because language is the way that they are able to communicate and to connect with each other and to really understand the world. They're worlds away, literally. And so this idea of being able to communicate with nuance and precision and respect is very important. He goes on. Even in the moment when he'd opened his eyes for the first time after his fall, he hadn't felt as distant from him as he did now. Back then, he had looked at him sitting in his great chair, and even though he was a stranger, he'd had the feeling that in some buried, unconscious part of himself, he knew exactly who he was. Now he felt that whatever had connected them before had been broken or taken away. He went to the fowling cliff, where Ivar had terrified him by lowering himself from the metal spike on one of his squeaky homemade ropes and dangled against the wrinkled cliff, a butterfly pinned against a black wall. Ivar, he shouted, shaking in the cold, amazed at his anguish. So this is getting a little bit into different territory, but I stand by the fact that this is really, it's language. It's beginning with this idea that if he could precisely speak the language, that he could express what he needed to. It also speaks to the connection between them, obviously. And this is, it's 25 pages before the book is going to end, but it's an important statement to the reader. It's also, at the end, what he is yelling is his name. He's yelling the name of this person, and it's the fact that he's yelling and using his voice, which is kind of allowing him to truly feel his anguish. I mean, I could talk for hours and hours about the language in this book and all of the different nuances. We are not going to do that because I do think it's one of the things that's kind of more obvious about the text, and it's certainly, you can listen to some other interview. Although I have to say, they all seemed a little more superficial than what we are doing here today. So we're going to close by taking a look at the times when clear is mentioned, and then we're going to take a look at the end of the novel. If you are someone who hasn't read it yet and doesn't want to know what happens at the end, you definitely need to tune out at this point. I'll say my little ending now. Thanks for listening. Is that what I usually say? Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. And this is not the very first time that it's mentioned, but it's one of the first few times. So here we are on page 152. We haven't seen a lot of this yet in the lecture. This is Ivar thinking. And it's actually very beautiful because it's kind of in dialogue with the part that we just read about John recognizing the importance of their relationship. This is Ivar thinking. Looking back, he wondered if he had always known, if it had been clear to him from the beginning that his visitor must have been sent by the estate, only he had not wanted to believe it. Then down at the end of this chunk, looking back, there was only one thing that was completely clear to him, and that was that he loved the time he had spent with John Ferguson. So beautiful. And this idea of clear being repeated like this, it speaks also to the clarity of the prose and the way that this relationship between these men is becoming more clear to them, but it's also being made very clear to the reader. And this is so tense. So this is at the end when somebody, we don't actually know it from this very first sentence, we don't know who has the pistol. Someone has the pistol. We don't know if it's John or if it's Ivar. So on 171, it does become fairly clear. It is Ivar who has the pistol. On 171, we have this. The operation of the pistol was more complicated than he thought it would be. So in the marginalia there, I have unclear. It's unclear, it's complicated. It's so dramatic. This is the kind of drama. I mean, this is the Chekhovian thing. At the beginning, we have the arrival of the pistol, and now we have Ivar, ready to fire the pistol, but it's more complicated. I mean, it's unclear. It's crazy. So then we have a problem because the weather is unclear. So on the very next page, on 172, we have this beautiful repetition of the word clear. On a clear day, he would have seen that the vessel from which the boat had come was not the Lily Rose, but something smaller, slighter, like an ordinary trading smack. On a clear day, he would have seen that the occupants of the boat were not who he expected them to be. On a clear day, he would have recognized Mary. But the day was not clear. The white mist had thickened into a low-slung bluish fog that had tucked itself between the shore and the Carys, veiling them and the Laura and everything else beyond them, and falling in a cloudy haze over the shallow water close to the beach. So beautiful. This repetition of clear, I just love the fact that this word is becoming more and more frequent as the book, and here he's talking about these not being clear, but for the reader, everything is getting clarified. It's so beautifully done. So now we're at the very end of the novel, and this is just, I found this incredibly moving. It was such a satisfying ending, but we're definitely doing spoilers here. I'm mostly just going to read the text and allow you to just kind of bask in how beautiful it is, but also just how, I mean, it's very clear. It's momentous. It feels so simple and right and correct, and it really makes you feel like, why is everything so complicated in this world when love can be so clear? Okay, so on 182, we're talking about Mary here, and honestly, I haven't given justice to the fact that this is very tense. We don't know what's going to happen. Mary is like looking at John and Ivar, and she is picking up, some kind of energy, and we're like, oh my God, what is she going to do? So here is this momentous thing. She turned her eyes away from Ivar and looked at John. You never knew in advance if a decision was the right one. All you could do was try to imagine the future and use that to help you make up your mind in a difficult situation. And if you couldn't imagine the future, well, you had to make up your mind anyway. He could come with us, she said. Instead of 2, we could be 3. So beautiful, so beautiful. And really, I mean, for me, very unexpected. I think for most readers, unexpected. It's simple, it's clear, it's just gorgeous. So in the last 4 pages of the book, we find they're going to Norway, which was interesting to me. They're not, in fact, returning. I love that idea. They're going to go to Scandinavia. I feel like, everyone's happier in Scandinavia. And on pages 184 and 85, we have this gorgeous stuff. But the first part has to do with religion. This is the last thing about religion that I didn't talk about earlier. And I love the fact that this is being resolved at the end. It's really, in some ways, this is being kind of tied in a bow, but in such an interesting bow that I'm here for it. Okay, 184. In time, Mary thought she would ask John about his plans for the church. He'd made no mention of them while they were helping Ivar pack, and his departure from the old church to the new one seemed a long time ago now, as if the new one itself was already old. But he would talk to her about it all when he was ready. She knew him well enough for that, just as she knew it was in the nature of churches to be constantly splintering and dividing and disagreeing about things and starting again. It was their specialty, she supposed, and she would have to wait and see what, if anything, he came up with. It's so beautiful. It's so accepting, and it's so kind of open. She doesn't know, and she's fine with that, and she trusts him to make the right decision. And also, what's so satisfying about that is, as a reader, I don't really care what happens with the church. I'm just interested in what happens with John and Ivar. So as long as John and Ivar and Mary are good, whatever, church schmirch. But then the next paragraph, and these are the last couple paragraphs of the book. And I love this part so much. Meanwhile, it was very cramped in their makeshift quarters on the Laura, and when they weren't up on deck, they were crushed together on the floor. And although John seemed preoccupied at times, he was mostly busy, with Ivar, showing Mary the pile of papers on which were written all of the words they had so far recorded, and which Ivar spoke aloud to Mary so she would know them too. I have 5 hearts in the marginalia here. I mean, it's just so sweet. It also is really underscoring the crucial nature of language, and the fact that they're sharing it with Mary so she would know these words too it's just so beautiful. And then we go on. As the need arose, they added new ones, words for sail and eider duck, for seasickness and toothache, and other more difficult, less tangible notions, like snipper, something rolled up or entangled, or scrim, a glimpse, a faint shining. They added the word for husband and the word for wife, and when John Ferguson ran out of ink, he borrowed a small bottle of iodine from Mr. Baxter's medicine box so they could keep going. And although the words were a little pale on the page, they were legible and like a prayer or a gentle weather forecast. They accompanied Ivar and the Fergusons on their journey north. Incredible. It's like a prayer or a weather. I mean, she's pulling all of these strings together in a way that is so beautiful and optimistic and unusual. I'm so moved by this book. That's probably an excellent place to end. So I want to thank you for tuning in. This is a book that I honestly, I can't go back and reread it right away because there's just way too many things I want to read. So you may feel like that also. If you are someone who is a rereader, this is a book that, I essentially reread these things when I go back through and I look at them to prepare for the lecture. This one just keeps on giving and giving and giving. It is so beautiful and so complex and so rich. It's a marvel. So thank you so much for listening and for tuning in. Happy reading.